Thank you for joining us for this webinar today. The webinar is called Flood Cleanup by Dr. Jean Cole, hosted by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Indoor Environments Division. Just a little housekeeping before we start. The webinar is scheduled from 1 o'clock to 2:30 p.m. and we'll have an opportunity at the end for Dr. Cole to answer some of the questions that you've all submitted through the question and answer pane during the webinar. The webinar will be recorded and we'll have the slides up on our website in the near future. This webinar will be presented by Dr. Jean Cole, who is a Director of Research for LRC Indoor Testing and Research in Cary, North Carolina, and formerly Professor of Environmental Health Sciences at Brigham Young University, Provo, Utah. His research focuses on ecology of indoor environments, with special emphasis on indication and reduction of pollutant reservoirs and sources, bioaerosols, human exposure assessment and control, product evaluation, cleaning and restoration, mold and sewage remediation, and biocides. He has been a contributor to multiple editions of the IICRC S500 Water Damage Restoration Standard and the S520 Mold Remediation Standard, and is also a co-author of the publication Suggested Guidelines for Remediation of Damage from Sewage Backflow into Buildings. He holds both a Master of Science degree in Public Health Microbiology and a Doctorate of Public Health in Biohazard Science and Occupational Health from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We're very happy to have such an accomplished speaker with us today to help us learn about flood cleanup. Please note that this presentation reflects the opinion of the speaker and not those of the U.S. EPA. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Jean Cole. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarani, and good morning or good afternoon to those of you participating in the webinar across the country. The focus today, of course, is flood damaged houses with guidance for safe cleaning, decontamination, and reoccupation. This webinar focuses on a situation that EPA and others recognized in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And that is that many individuals being kept from their home environment area for 1, 2, or 3 weeks before they could gain access, returned to find their homes obviously in disrepair. Though floodwaters had receded, their homes remained water damaged and contaminated. These individuals lacked insurance to cover professional cleanup and remediation. They had no personal funds to foster professional cleanup. The property was typically mortgaged. So without much of a choice, their goal was to remediate through cleanup that property and inhabit it. That was their home environment, and that would remain such for the future. While it's not recommended that individuals do extensive flood damage cleanup to their own homes, it was recognized at that point that there was a need to provide guidance for individuals making that choice. And so hence the topic for this webinar. As stated here, the information in this presentation has been compiled from a very extensive review of flood cleanup guidance documents from a variety of agencies and organizations, some at the federal level, such as US EPA, the Centers for Disease Control, Housing and Urban Development, FEMA, state government agencies, the state departments of health, non-governmental, the American Red Cross, the IICRC, which is a standard-setting and certifying body for the professional water damage restoration and cleaning industry. The information has been compiled over a number of years. It has recently been finalized, and a comprehensive report will soon be made available. And this is the potential cover to that report. It is a 100-plus page document that will provide much detail, especially relative to where the recommendations come from that it includes. We're now going to address water categories. The categories that I'm going to describe have been accepted by industry, government, non-governmental organizations as the best way to classify or categorize the degree of flood cleanup and remediation that needs to be done to render home environments back to their pre-flood condition. The categories are based on scientific and technical information that's been gathered and focuses on the source of the water and the quality of the water. The quality designates the hazardousness, which may change over time and needs to be addressed in terms of the way the cleanup is conducted and also those who are doing it, the way they need to be protected. So these water categories are referred to as Category 1, 2, and 3. Category 1, clean water. This is within a home from a clean source, no immediate health concern. For example, a child plugs the drain in a tub, runs the water from the faucet, and then forgets about it, runs outside to play. The tub overflows, and we have a limited area flood condition in the home. Since it's clean water, it's not intrinsically contaminated. As long as it's addressed quickly, there's little concern. Obviously, the water needs to be extracted, and examination needs to be done to determine the penetration of the clean water. The water needs to be removed by moving air, dehumidification, and then it needs to be inspected for several days later to ensure the absence of odors, which would indicate microbial growth. Category 2 would be gray water. This is more of a concern because this water does have some contamination. Classic examples would be from a dishwasher or a washing machine. If they leak, they flood an area in the home, and it's similar to Category 1, although now we recognize that water contains microorganisms. And because of that, there is expedience that's required, perhaps more so than a Category 1, to quickly remove the water, dry the affected materials in order to prevent a situation where, if left sitting, could actually become Category 3. So let's talk about Category 3, often termed black water. Category 3 situation is typically enters the home from the exterior, as evidenced by flood water. So it could be rising river water, seawater, sewage. If the source is within the home, it's usually a massive pressurized sewage backflow, typically originating from a problem with the sanitary sewer system in the community. Category 3 water contains a variety of potential human disease agents and also toxic substances, residues, a variety of chemicals that go down a drain that we're all familiar with. And upon human exposure, these chemicals, these microorganisms, and their products or components may have an adverse effect upon human health. Next slide shows more specifically what we're talking about in terms of, first, microbial contamination. Certainly bacteria. These can be environmental. They can be of human origin. Viruses would typically be from human secretions, exudates, and waste materials. Fungi, which would be molds and yeasts, parasites that would typically occur in a variety of sewage situations. And these contaminants present both an infectious, an allergic, and sometimes a toxic risk. And I'll address that more in a moment. Chemical contaminants, residues of pesticides, fuels, solvents. Think of floodwaters running over woodland or agricultural farmland, or even a parking lot that's paved, picking up residues of oil and other solvents, greases, and so forth that have leaked or dripped from cars and trucks. All of this gets taken up by floodwaters and can enter a home or building environment from the soil and soil associated with industrial areas. Not untypical to find residues of lead, arsenic, mercury, and then gases such as methane, sulfur dioxide. Those typically will be a result of standing water inside a home environment where they're confined and present an additional hazard to those doing the cleanup. I'll address the topic briefly of water categories changing over time. So after 24 hours, water categories can change. Category 2 water, if left unremediated, can become Category 3 due to time and increased temperature, where we have essentially incubation conditions for a slew of bacteria and fungi, particularly molds, that can continue to grow and multiply until the water becomes grossly contaminated, which defines Category 3. Such situations, for example, can actually result from a Category 1 water loss. I remember a situation in a mountainous environment in the U.S. where someone had a mountain cabin that they used periodically during the year, but not very frequently. They would leave the temperature on, particularly in the wintertime, to prevent pipes from freezing. Well, they allowed individuals to use that cabin, but those individuals, when they left, turned off the heat. Pipes froze, burst, and it wasn't until 2 weeks later that someone discovered the water still running, several feet deep, extensive water damage. And in that time period, the water had turned from Category 2 to Category 3 due to the microbial multiplication. Category 1 can become Category 2, again, if it's allowed to sit for several hours, typically 24 or more, it can become Category 2. Microorganisms are everywhere, and under the right conditions of moisture, availability to water, very damp conditions, both bacteria and mold can grow, amplify, and become Category 3. We'll focus on one of the most serious consequences of flood-damaged homes and the time factor relative to Category 3 water, and that's mold contamination. And most of us, I think, are aware that molds typically reproduce by a mechanism utilizing structures that they form called spores. Spores are essentially seed-like structures, just like we plant vegetable or flower seeds in a garden, add water, they germinate and grow. The same situation is in effect for mold spores. These are seeds that can be widely disseminated. They can be produced in heavily contaminated areas by the millions. Wherever they land, if there's enough available moisture, then they can begin to grow. And then grow quickly if conditions are optimum for their reproduction. We call this amplification. And then, due to air currents, activity in the area, individuals coming in to clean up the flood damage, extract the water, remove the damaged materials, there can be extensive dissemination of these spores. Mold growth always follows the path of water migration, and many can reproduce on materials, which we'll discuss, porous and semi-porous materials, as we call them in particular, that provide a substrate or food source for their continued growth, amplification, and dissemination. As molds land upon materials where they begin to grow, gain a foothold, they began to use substrates as nutrient sources. And so it becomes a rapid sequence of development of extensive microbial contamination. And in the process, it degrades materials that we'll discuss, wallboard, wood, and other materials. Because of the spores and mold fragments released in the environment, it provides a risk to those doing the cleanup as well as those that may occupy the home environment in the future. And it does put individuals to a variety of health effect risks. Here's a situation looking at the list on the left of substrates, nutrient sources. On the right, you see a photograph of mold actually utilizing some type of substrate to grow. And this is under very warm and high humidity conditions. Looking at the list of substrates, these are materials that we would need to address in a flood cleanup situation. Wood products, mainly framework, plywood, roof trusses, anything made of wood that typically is associated with structural materials and also furnishing materials. Wallboard, which is sheetrock or drywall, wallpaper. Many molds love wallpaper, and in particular, wallpaper glue. Molds, when they attach to a surface and begin to utilize the substrate as a food source, they excrete enzymes that will actually dissolve the material so that the material nutrient sources can be utilized by those molds. And so in that enzymatic process, those materials, those substrates are degraded. A ceiling tile. This is quite an extensive problem. If it's damp, ceiling tile is typically 95% cellulose. So it's just like molds growing on vegetables in your refrigerator, for example. Extremely nutrient source. Various insulation materials, as well as fireproofing, and glues and sealants are often excellent nutrient sources. Now, the photograph that you see came from a study that was sponsored years ago by the US EPA, and which I was a part of, and it was looking at the germination of mold spores and their growth amplification under various conditions of temperature and humidity. And these various materials were inoculated with a known number of mold spores and then placed in these temperature humidity chambers, and data collected in terms of did the spores germinate, how long did it take for visible mold to appear, under which conditions provided the optimum conditions for mold growth amplification. What's interesting here, this was a situation categorized in this photo where mold spores were inoculated to brand new fiberglass insulation. Now, this insulation had not been used and not been removed from a building or a home, where typically it, at the very least, would have a layer of dust on it. In that situation, then the dust can provide a substrate or a food source for mold attachment, germination, growth, and amplification. This was brand new fiberglass insulation, and we found, as you can see, extensive mold growth. Well, investigating this situation, we found that this was insulation that had been produced by a manufacturer who had treated the insulation with an antimicrobial chemical aimed at prohibiting the growth of bacteria should the insulation become wet for some reason. Well, that's a nice concept. However, manufacturer obviously did not consider or realize the consequences in that antimicrobial chemical being sprayed on the fiberglass insulation actually was a food source for certain molds. So that's how specialized and, what shall we say, focused in terms of different habitats and niches wherein mold can grow and utilize nutrients that hadn't been thought of before. So there's always consideration of all materials and substances used in the construction, the finishing, and the furnishing of flood-damaged home environments. Photograph on the left was a home environment that had been flooded with several inches of water. A water damage restoration company was called. They extracted the water, removed the wall-to-wall water-saturated carpet, but for some reason were asked to stop at that point. There was some type of conflict with this property, and attorneys became involved, and what you see is what that home looked like, at least in that one area, 3 weeks later. The wallboard, that drywall or sheetrock, had become an excellent substrate for mold growth. What you can't really tell in this photo is, as the growth proceeds from the concrete floor up the drywall, that the mold continues all the way to the ceiling. The water has whipped up the drywall, and some molds prefer higher amounts of water than others. So the ones that you see visibly there at the bottom and have colors of black and brown and some green actually grow in extremely damp or wet conditions. Going further up the wall, which really are not that visible in that photograph, are other molds that grow at less of a water content in the material, but they're still there. That drywall must be removed. And then there's concern of what lies behind it, because obviously water has penetrated the baseboard and will actually have penetrated the wall cavity, the inner wall cavity behind there. And mold most likely would have been growing on structural materials such as framing, insulation, and the like. On the photograph on the right is some micrographs of that drywall material, and on the left of that photo you'll see actual hyphae and mold growing. This happens to be Stachybotrys. Many refer to this as black mold or toxic mold. Actually, many molds can potentially produce toxins. To the right on that photograph, you can actually see the Stachybotrys spores that could easily disseminate during the remediation, during the removal of that drywall and the subsequent cleanup, which is why, as we get into remediation, we need to think and keep in the back of our mind the need for containment when this type of work is done and these materials removed. Let's continue with potential human exposures and health effects regarding this type of contamination in a home that's to be remediated from flood damage, and look at the three categories that we typically refer to. What are the health risks of these types of molds in particular in a water-damaged home environment? Well, we categorize in three ways: allergic, toxic, and infectious risks. Obviously, many of these molds are recognized as allergens, and certainly they could trigger adverse health effects, respiratory effects in those that have respiratory allergies. They could trigger asthma in some individuals, depending upon the level of exposure and the length of time of exposure. It might initiate an allergic response. or at least some type of respiratory dysfunction. The toxic risks, many molds produce mycotoxins, not just Stachybotrys. Stachy has the most notoriety, but also species of Penicillium and Aspergillus, which tend to predominate in flood damage situations. And there's others. Trichoderma is another one. The concern here is that these mycotoxins can be contained not only on the surface of materials on which the molds are growing, but in the materials. And so when we actually get to steps in remediation of flood damaged homes and removal of these contaminated materials, we want people working with gloved hands. Mycotoxins can potentially be absorbed through human skin and have effects upon the skin as well as potentially the nervous system. Similarly, we will be recommending respiratory protection for those doing the flood damage cleanup. Inhalation of these spores can contain mycotoxins that can have respiratory effects or effects on other organs and tissues as they become transported through the blood. The last would be infection. And so we're talking about individuals who are immunosuppressed or immunocompromised, perhaps in some cases completely. So we're talking about transplant patients, certainly those on chemotherapy, other immunosuppressive illnesses or conditions. They're certainly at risk for what we call opportunistic mold infections. These are infections that if a normal, healthy individual were exposed, inhaled, even what we might term an appreciable number of these spores, would be unaffected, and their pulmonary system, their lungs, would clear those out. But someone who is on medication to suppress immune function, or they have a condition or illness, as we stated, it might be cancer, it might be bone marrow transplant, and the like. They are extremely susceptible. And we've known for over 3 decades now that there have been hundreds and hundreds of situations across the U.S. in healthcare environments where those on bone marrow transplant units, cancer wards, where individuals are immunosuppressed, children with leukemia, and the like have been infected because those healthcare facilities had extensive water damage, which were unknown to the facility, such as ceiling spaces or return air plenums, ductwork, and the like. So I'm just couching that risk in the sense of it still exists for those who are attempting to do the flood cleanup of their own home. We have consensus these days across the board from many organizations and agencies. I just share some here with you. U.S. EPA has stated all molds have the potential to cause health attacks. The Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Sciences, landmark publication in 2004 entitled Damp Spaces and Indoor Health stated excessive indoor dampness is a public health problem. And the main reason for that is that dampness can precipitate the growth of both bacteria and mold, which can present risks, as I've stated, in regard to allergy, toxicity, and potential infection. And then ACGIH, which is Professional Industrial Hygiene Association that works in the occupational environments, active fungal growth in indoor environments is inappropriate. It lead to exposures and adverse health effects. Let's go to the next slide and outline what we'll be discussing today, more specifically in this seminar. And that is 8 steps that you see here. So we'll be addressing operational structural safety relative to protecting those doing the work. We want them to utilize personal protective equipment. The first step, assuming water has drained or been extracted, is to remove the salvable or unsalvable materials, what can be retained and cleaned and put back in the home after everything is completed or not. Then we have some structural activity to consider in terms of removing water damaged, mold-contaminated porous materials. We then undergo a cleaning process or muck out. At the same time, begin drying the environment. We'll discuss biocides, which can be used, but if they are to be used, there is much to be known about their use, and we categorize their use as to be done with caution. Drying is essential, and then prior to reoccupying the home environment, the homeowner who's done this work needs to conduct a clearance evaluation. Is it safe now? Is everything clean? Is it time to rebuild? Put those walls and ceilings back, do the painting, the caulking, replace cabinetry, and so forth prior to moving in. So let's go ahead and begin to address these 8 steps, which would be personal protective equipment. And as I've stated here, although floodwaters may have receded from the area, standing water may still be in the house. And unfortunately, we know of a number of situations where individuals wanting to go in and assess damage, even with a few inches of water still remaining in the home, have stepped in, and unfortunately, the power had not been turned off. And extensive shock or electrocution, of course, may occur. So something simple is ensuring that the power indeed is off, their wires are not in contact with the water. So simple but extremely important safety measure. And then, again, if there has been water still sitting there, even a small amount, animals may have taken shelter. There may be snakes, or in certain areas of the country, there could be an alligator in there. Animals that have become trapped and obviously present hazards to those individuals that walk in. And then certainly the structural integrity of the home itself. How does it look from the exterior? Is there a roof that's drooping? Is there a foundation that's cracked and crumbling? Are there concerns that this structure that is left may collapse? This is an assessment that should be made prior to entering the water-damaged environment. Continuing with personal protective equipment, we want individuals to be properly protected. And yes, it's going to be a very warm, typically, and very humid environment, but we do recommend for this initial walkthrough and then start of the cleanup, individual in long pants, long sleeve shirts, proper footwear, preferably boots or work shoes of some type, certainly not bare feet, flip-flops, too many physical hazards, and then exposure to, again, the Category 3 or black water and its contaminants. Respiratory protection, it nowadays is available at home improvement stores, even supermarkets. An N95 disposable mask is inexpensive and certainly worth the price. I do recommend those that have an exhaust valve built in to avoid the buildup of humidity in the mask and maintain its useful function over time where it doesn't become saturated and lose its effectiveness. The last bullet here on this slide, keep individuals with conditions that make it difficult to breathe away from cleanup activities. So individuals with, again, respiratory allergies, those that have asthma, well, those with asthma certainly couldn't wear a standard respirator and might even have problems with a disposable respirator. Any respirator provides additional stress to the breathing process, makes it harder to breathe. And we would urge individuals that have those health conditions to refrain from participating in those activities. So now that we're effectively garbed and our focus is identifying and removing salvable and unsalvable materials. So some furniture, clothing, appliances, and others will be damaged beyond repair. If there's been a washing machine and the motor has sat in water for 2 weeks, it's unlikely, due to the insulation materials, the wiring, glues, sealants, and so forth, that it can be restored to its pre-flood condition and remain working. Certainly furniture comprised of a number of different substrates that we've spoken about can be actively growing mold and bacteria and will not be capable of being restored to pre-flood conditions, and in fact may be very much at risk in terms of human health. Things that are non-porous and are made of metal or made of glass, clothing, for example, may typically be able to be laundered and salvaged. It may take several washings. That's a determination that will need to be made. As things are brought out of the house, they need to be separated, and those that are salvageable certainly moved to a safe area for subsequent cleaning and reconditioning. And so we'll go to a slide that actually shows someone going through the removal of materials prior to the indoor cleaning of the flood-damaged home. And we can already see upholstered furniture that's not going to be salvable. It will have sat in a damp environment for days to maybe 1 or 2 weeks. It has gathered moisture, is replete with microbial contamination. There is no way to effectively clean and dry and restore those materials. Now we see an individual carrying items out, and I will point out, after we just talked about personal protective equipment, that she is not protected, does not have long sleeves, may even be wearing shorts, no respiratory protection, probably does not have gloves, and so this is not an ideal situation. So this is a good example of how we're not to do the removal of materials. As we go to the next slide, we'll be a little more specific in terms of what might be salvable and non-salvable. Electronic equipment, if it had no contact with water, potentially, even though it's been in a high humidity environment, might be salvable. It might take a specialist who does that type of restorative work to do that. So if there is electronic equipment, if there are appliances that are very high value, then if they were not submerged, if they appear to look salvable, then recommendation would be take them to a professional that specializes in restoring electronic equipment and electronic appliances. High-value rugs is always an issue. This is an issue that myself and colleagues of mine have dealt with for the last couple of decades in sewage backflow situations where high-value rugs, such as a $10,000 or $20,000 Oriental rug, for example, has been submerged in sewage. An insurance company does not want to replace that. Someone has insurance for water damage, and they'll typically recommend that it be cleaned by a professional. Professional flood damage restoration companies can't clean rugs, but we have no standard or test by which we can ensure that after the professional cleaning is done, that rug has been acceptably sanitized and can be placed back in a clean home environment without risk to occupants. And I think the greatest risk would be, for example, a toddler crawling on that rug that had been submerged in Category 3 water, typically contaminated with sewage, chemical residuals, and so forth. It has been effectively, as far as we know, cleaned by a professional, yet there's no way we can be assured. So that is something that needs to be addressed and judged by the homeowner in conjunction with advice and recommendations from others. And of course, every water damage situation is different and unique. An entire community can be extensively flooded, but each home is different. Each has been furnished differently, perhaps structurally made with different components. Water has drained from some very efficiently and not from others. So each flood damage situation is very unique, and we have to consider that in terms of the cleanup and the salvability of materials. As you see in the second bullet here, clothing and bedding. By bedding, we mean sheets, pillowcases, blankets that typically can be laundered and dried and perhaps should be laundered several times. Again, we have no way to test these, but if they're effectively laundered, dried, and it's been done at least 2 or 3 times, it should be effective, normally is. Now, mattresses, mattress pads and the like, very porous and absorbent, and it's not recommended, particularly mattresses, that they be salvaged. Mattresses, the traditional ones, of course, internally have been constructed of a variety of organic materials, cotton batting and other organic-based materials, some of which we may not know of where they come from or where they've been made. But it's correct for us to assume that the moisture has at least penetrated those internal organic components and have been growing and will still grow mold and bacteria. And depositing a mattress on a front lawn on a sunny day is not going to solve the problem, and that's something that we do not recommend attempts at salvaging. And then, as I mentioned previously, the last bullet, non-porous contents, dinnerware, glass, ceramics, metal objects, a simple detergent rinsing, and we can salvage those materials. It's not unusual for individuals coming back 1, 2, 3 weeks later to be greeted with this type of scene in their home environment. This is how rapidly water can wick up materials. It's a high humid environment. All surfaces and materials are now growing mold and associated bacteria, especially those structural materials that are semi-porous, such as fiberboard, OSB, oriented strand board, plywood, even hardwood materials have to be removed. They're not salvageable. And of course, this gives us great cause for concern. In this situation, the homeowner is going to do this themselves. They absolutely have to be properly protected, as we've discussed previously. We're going to discuss physical cleaning and how important this is. So at this point, we have individuals who are properly garbed and protected, going in after water has been extracted or has drained away previously to returning, and now it's physically removing the dirt, the soil, the silt from the river water, and the like. Sometimes it requires wheelbarrow and shovels, other times raking it or sweeping it up. At this point in time, we want to clean these materials out in bulk as much as possible in order that we can begin the drying process and begin to investigate the penetration of the water into subflooring, behind cabinets, into interior wall spaces, and the like. You see the note I have there. Cleaning and remediation of assemblies such as floor and ceilings, built-in cabinetry and bookcases, and obviously heating and air conditioning systems may require the attention of a water damage restoration expert. Now, we are going to get very soon to the importance of drying. And once the waters have receded, excess moisture has been extracted, the cleaning or muck out has been done, the power is back on in the home. It's very easy for a homeowner to say, well, let's flip on the air conditioning system and help to dry out this environment. And of course, air conditioning systems work on a dehumidification process and can be extremely helpful. However, if that air handling system has not been assessed, if ductwork is in the flooring that's been flooded, or if it's in the ceiling and it hasn't been directly flooded, but has been sitting for days or a week or two in a high humidity environment, we can rightly assume that there is microbial contamination, which first must be addressed before that heating and air conditioning system is reactivated and the switch is turned to turn it on. So the homeowner certainly can do initial inspection, but in terms of maintenance and adequate operation and electrical safety, that air handling system should require some professional advice. We see some individuals who doing the muck out, top left individual, again, very common. It's a hot, humid weather condition. Fortunately, this individual, it appears, is wearing some proper footwear, but has skin exposed, no respiratory protection. In the bottom photo, at least they appear to be wearing Tyvek suits, safety shoes, and are now using water and detergent to do the cleaning, or as you see here, getting the muck out. We'll focus now on cleaning, and this is the removal of any standing water, debris, trash. We've gotten the salvable items out, and we're looking at using detergents. Yes, detergents in water. And so our first reaction might be, wait a minute, we're going to put more water back in? Well, water is going to be the best means of using a detergent to help clean, just as we normally clean a variety of surfaces and materials in our home. There's not water damage, yet we have to remove that water when we're done and initiate drying. So yes, most cleaning will involve an aqueous solution of water and detergents. We may have to bring in a pressure washer, which needs to be used carefully, as we could actually, under pressure, force moisture and water into cracks and crevices and cavities and spaces that we ordinarily would not want to. And if it happens, we would have to ensure their extraction and proper drying. Last bullet there, if it's not raining and someone's living in a dry environment, they can open windows and doors, get ventilation, begin drying things out. Drying depends upon how dry the outdoor air is compared to the indoor air. Not unusual, these flood damage situations occur in very humid environments. And so we don't want to open doors and windows. We want to dry out that indoor environment. We're going to close doors and windows. We've removed salvable materials. We are initiating drying. We've cleaned everything out, and we want to dehumidify the air. Now, drying is typically facilitated by moving air across a wet or damp surface. We do this when we use a hairdryer, for example. How does a hairdryer work? Well, it blows warm, dry air through our hair, strips off the water molecules, sends those into the air. Typically, an indoor home environment is at a low humidity. Might be in the 40s or even high 30s, and the moisture will stay there in the air. However, in a high humidity environment, whatever water molecules move off a damp surface, if it's very high moisture content in the air, which we call relative humidity, then those water molecules will tend to recondense on surfaces. And so it's self-defeating unless we can get that water out of the air. And so dehumidification is extremely essential. We can start the drying process and the dehumidification process when we initiate cleaning. Again, we're going to be putting typically more moisture in. We want to do that as drying is initiated. As I have here in the middle bullet, if drying stops too soon, microbial growth immediately can begin to recur. Porous materials, wood, open cell foam, those egg crate type of foam pads, for example, carpet pads, just act as sponges. They're not readily amenable to drying, will require a lot of extra time, or easiest might be just to replace those. And again, carpet, particularly wall-to-wall, and if it's not high value, it shouldn't attempt to be remediated. Again, this is a Category 3 flood damage situation. We have a pictorial which will appear in the report that will be made available to the public, and which is webinar based, to show activity. So the salvable and unsalvable materials have been removed below ground in the basement area. The drying and dehumidification is ongoing while an individual is assessing the wood framing and whether it needs to be replaced or not. But the drywall insulation material have all been removed. On the ground level, we have ongoing cleaning, again, as well as drying and dehumidification. And then on the upper level, we see on the right room, there were materials that were placed there that, as the flood began to occur, were not water damaged and were preserved from exposure. And on the left, we see a bathroom environment that, usually high humidity anyway, is being dried down, and microbial contamination being remediated. We see a containment curtain there between the two rooms. When large open surfaces are dry to the touch, water can still remain in cavities, cracks, and non-contaminated porous materials that are still intact. They may be dryable. I mentioned before, but some cavities can be opened and aired out. Others can be accessed only by removing built-in cabinets, making holes in the kick spaces, soffits, smaller ceiling cavities. May require the use of a professional. But again, an emphasis at this point in time on moving air, increasing dehumidification, and those cavities and structural spaces will take some time to dry, and it's usually several days, usually at least 72 hours or more. We talked about cleaning, flooring, and related structural materials. This is the basis, again, for their use. It emulsifies soil and silts and contaminants associated with them. Other materials might be used. Microfiber cloths have been shown in science-based studies to be extremely effective in cleaning based upon the physical construction, if you will, of those cloths in retaining particulates as they are moved across the surface. And we see a pictorial here of someone using microfiber cloths to wipe down surfaces, in this case cabinetry, that appears to be salvable. And then there's steam cleaning. So on structural framing, perhaps on some cabinetry materials, flooring, certainly tile, ceramic flooring could be useful in effective cleaning of materials in the flooded environment. We begin to address the topic of biocides. And of course, biocides are chemical formulations. By nature, bio means living, and sides, kill. So we're looking to kill life forms, typically bacteria, fungi, viruses, parasites. And these will have a statement on their label that they are a disinfectant or a sanitizer or antimicrobial. By law, if that appears, then they are required by law to be approved by the U.S. EPA as part of their antimicrobial pesticide regulatory requirement. Some of these products may be more specific, and the label may have claims such as bactericidal, fungicidal, virucidal, indicating they will kill, inactivate, or otherwise neutralize those particular organisms. We are going to place a lot of emphasis on using biocides with caution. If they're going to be used and they have any of those labeled terms, then they should have an EPA registration number which confirms effectiveness when used according to label directions. They're not to be used indiscriminately. They're not to be used at full strength. They must be used according to label instructions on a pre-cleaned surface, or it may be a detergent disinfectant that's used on pre-cleaned surfaces at the prescribed dilution. In attending to these label directions, we hope to foster the effective use of these biocides in the role that they're employed, as well as protect those that are using them and those that may occupy the environment in the future. In using them, we have to be conscious of the fact that we're bringing in a chemical or chemicals that present a hazard in and of themselves. We don't want to replace a microbial hazard with a chemical one. So typically after using a biocide, we're looking at another cleaning step in order to remove residuals of biocides. So the last bullet I have on this slide, most biocides require use on pre-cleaned surfaces to be effective. That's how they've been assessed effective and registered by the EPA. However, that raises the question, if we've effectively cleaned surfaces and physically removed the soil, the silt, the microbial contamination, do we really need the use of a biocide? A drying is underway. We're drying and removing the moisture very effectively. We're going to be inactivating microbes that remain just through the drying process. So it's a point of consideration. And with that, we'll go to the next slide and our lists of caution. So why are we concerned about using biocides? Well, we have bacteria in particular that have, over decades of use, developed resistance to specific classes of biocides, be they disinfectants or sanitizers. So they may not be that effective. Many of them are inactivated by organic matter. So that would be the silts and the soil, the residue that remains even after we've removed the water, we've done the muck out, we perhaps used a HEPA vacuum to remove dust. There still will be some residue, and organic matter typically will affect some of these types of biocides. Most affected would be the hypochlorites, which of course would be bleach products. We have difficulty reaching all areas of contamination, every nook and cranny. And again, wall spaces, ceiling spaces, behind cabinetry, baseboards if they haven't been removed, and that type of thing. If we can't reach them, then we can't have a proper contact time. And again, each label of EPA-registered biocide has a prescribed dwell time, 10 minutes, to remain wet in contact on a surface to achieve the desired inactivation of microbes. There can be adverse material incompatibilities. For example, using bleach again, corrosive to metals. It can stain a variety of materials. It can bleach a variety of furniture, clothing materials, and the like. Human exposure risks. In fact, hypochlorite, as it stands, and I assume it's in every home in the country, it's considered very common. And that bottle of bleach is highly caustic chemical formulation, pH between 10 and 11. And it involves additional cost. Again, use biocides with caution. They can be helpful. They can expedite the decontamination process. They can deodorize the environment. As you see here in the second bullet, typically it's expedient to use a combination detergent disinfectant. So as we're cleaning what remains after materials have been removed from the home, this could be certainly helpful in suppressing the extent of microbial contamination. Bleach is no longer recommended, and I typically explained why. It's a caustic chemical, it's corrosive, it bleaches. We don't want individuals having skin exposure, having splashed in their eyes, using an improper dilution. It's neutralized by organic matter. And then there's always folks who say, gosh, I want to make my own super cleaning solution, and they'll mix it with another commercial cleaner containing ammonia, and that will liberate chlorine gas. And every year there are a few cases of individuals that succumb fatally to this exposure. Just want to point out very briefly, gas phase biocides are not recommended, and I'll put the emphasis particularly on ozone. So if you're doing your own flood damage, cleanup and restoration, and someone comes through the neighborhood and says, hey, I've got an ozone machine that can take care of all of this for you and decontaminate your home, my advice is tell them to move along. It's not going to work. Ozonators will generate ozone, but at the concentration needed, it can be damaging to materials, electrical wiring. It's an extreme hazard to the human respiratory system. And it can't be delivered, like biocides in general, every nook and cranny, and a concentration maintained long enough to inactivate microbes. So although ozone can occur naturally in the summertime as it interacts with pollutants in inner city environments, or occurs sometimes after a thunderstorm and lightning, and it is, quote, natural, it shouldn't be used in the home environment. The emphasis on drying, again, start drying at the beginning of the cleanup. It would be useful to monitor relative humidity. That can be done with simple instruments that can be purchased in a hardware store, home improvement store. But the key to keeping contamination down is rapid and effective drying. We can see this being done in a home environment. Commercial air movers and a dehumidifier can be rented or borrowed if they happen to be in your neighborhood. Again, monitoring indoor temperature and relative humidity is essential and can easily be done. We certainly in the home environment want to, as quickly as possible, get relative humidity below 60% and then continuing to decrease that over time. Hopefully by this point, the air handling system has been assessed, it has been cleaned, put back into service, and will also help to speed the dehumidification process. In terms of clearance, how do we know when we're ready to rebuild, start putting up walls and ceilings and repainting and making the home habitable again? Well, in terms of the homeowner, without professional help, it's doing this initial assessment. 3 questions. Is it dry? Does it feel dry? Does everything look and feel dry in the home at that point? Second, is it clean? Does it look clean? Is there an absence of mold contamination and dust on surfaces? And lastly, is there an odor? If there is still a musty, moldy, or mildew-like odor, then that's typically a sign that there's still a pocket somewhere or pockets of moisture and microbial growth. If individual homeowners can't answer those 3 questions reliably in a condition like you see here, so this is when to do the clearance evaluation, they may need the assistance of a professional. I mean, why spend hundreds and thousands of dollars bringing in drywall, ceiling materials, and other structural and furnishing materials if we're not absolutely sure that all moisture and contamination has been removed? The rebuilding has been done, and we are moving the family back in. Actually, how do we know that everything is clean, exposures will not occur, and so forth? Well, it's just going to take time, and we'll have to see if there are any adverse health effects that occur. So in the long term, the ultimate criterion for successful reoccupying the home is the ability of occupants to live there without health effects, without allergic type responses, if there's an asthmatic child, without increase in trigger of asthmatic effects and that type of thing. The last slide is just a sample of references that will be included in that report to soon be made available to the public. The actual report has pages and pages of useful material, but these are very basic yet very important guidance documents that are available now. They can be downloaded online and can be immediately helpful, all of them together, for those that are in a situation where they need to do the flood damage cleanup, remediation, and restoration themselves. And with that, I will end my presentation. I hope it's been of value to you, and we'll welcome some comments and questions.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. We have about 30 questions or so, or potentially more, that just came in, so we're going to try to see how many we can get through.
Okay.
Okay, so the first question we have is regarding mold. This spring, I heard a pediatric specialist say that if mold was found under a carpet, that children are not at risk of health effects from mold exposure. Please comment.
If I understand correctly, there can be mold under the carpet, and a pediatrician is saying that children would not be at risk? Is that correct?
That's what the question is asking, yes.
Okay, well, certainly if there's mold growing under a carpet, it means there's a problem in the home environment. There's a moisture problem, and the mold might be growing on the carpet. It needs to be investigated. Certainly the carpet should be removed, the source of the moisture addressed and fixed, and then either if it's a rug, perhaps it could be professionally cleaned. If it's wall-to-wall carpet, it's easy to replace it. But we're talking here about a situation where there's a known source of contamination, and why would we want to just assume that it's sealed off because it's under a carpet? If it's there at all, there's a source of moisture, and most likely the mold is utilizing the flooring surface under the carpet or the carpet itself as a substrate. It needs to be investigated, needs to be cleaned, and the carpet removed and replaced. There's no sense taking chances. Again, I envision, the ultimate risk of a toddler crawling on a carpet, and in that airspace, which would be breathing space a foot from the carpet, those mold spores could still be airborne and cause a problem. Next question.
Okay. What category would groundwater be considered? It's category 1.
Groundwater is category 3. Anything from the exterior is groundwater. As rain moves over exterior surfaces, soil, it can be, again, a parking lot, so forth. It picks up residues, microbial contaminants and chemical residues. So over a ground surface, even if it's your backyard that's covered with grass, it has picked up residues of pesticides, fertilizers, endemic, if you will, minerals, heavy metals that are in the soil naturally, and yes, so groundwater is always category 3.
Okay, the next question is, do you recommend products such as surface sealants that contain antimicrobial components to prevent mold or other kinds of microbial growth?
I think they can be useful, and it's been shown that they can be useful. Obviously, they have to be used properly, and that would be on clean, dry, non-contaminated surfaces in order to prevent microbial growth in the future. So yes, they can be very useful. There's an additional cost for them. We do know that molds love to grow on a variety of glues, sealants, as I mentioned, wallpaper paste and the like, using an antimicrobial to diminish the risk of microbial contamination on these different materials and substrates. I think it's fine, but again, they shouldn't be used. For example, if someone prepares an antimicrobial paint, it shouldn't be used to paint over mold-contaminated wood or wallboard. Most paints, particularly latex paints, are an excellent substrate for mold. Latex is organic, and most molds love to grow on latex paint. Oil-based paints will retard mold growth. So, in general, yes, these materials can be helpful. They incur an additional expense, but they need to be used properly on clean, uncontaminated surfaces for prevention in the future.
Okay. Can you comment on any special tips that you have for healthcare buildings, for example, a clinic that has been flooded? An example would be guidelines for drywall replacement.
For healthcare facilities, well, if the drywall has been in a flooded environment, even if it doesn't appear to be contaminated, it's, again, each situation is unique. How long was it exposed to flood water? Drywall is absorbent. The safest thing, drywall is very inexpensive. It would be prudent to replace it, especially in a healthcare facility situation. If there has been some flooding, let's say it's been minor in a healthcare facility, and the water's been extracted, there's been a cleanup, and maybe in the restoration process, wallboard has been cut, let's say 2 or 3 or even 4 feet from the bottom of the wall, and the rest of the drywall appears to be clean, dry, and intact. The question would be, was there moisture that penetrated that wall cavity? Had moisture been absorbed on the reverse side of the drywall? It's likely that depending upon the time that those conditions were met, is it hours, is it days, or a week or more, those types of information dictate whether it's prudent to remove the wallboard or not. But careful inspection, use of a moisture meter, which I presented briefly in one of the slides. In terms of moisture content, drywall, the maximum it should ever be in a appropriately conditioned indoor environment, never exceed 18%, and usually I use 16%. And again, where is this located? Is it in a high humidity environment, southeastern U.S., Gulf Coast, or is it western U.S., dry? So all of those taken into consideration. Hopefully that addresses some of those concerns about drywall in a healthcare facility.
The next question is, can you please talk about mold on cinder blocks? How could it grow? If it uses their cinder block, how would you clean it, et cetera?
Interesting question. Yes, actually mold can grow on cinder block, on concrete foundations and so forth. In fact, it's interesting. We don't often refer to this or see it referred to, but there is actually a type of bacterium that can grow on concrete and degrade the concrete, but most of the time it's a situation of mold growth. Cinder blocks and concrete surfaces will attract dust, silt, residue, and it's on the organic residue that mold grows. As it grows on soil, silt, some organic material that's on on cinder block or concrete surfaces inside or outside of a home. Those surfaces can be cleaned, again, with a detergent disinfectant and should be inspected for integrity. One has to be careful. Again, cinder blocks and concrete are alkaline in nature, and using a biocide that is more acidic could actually help in the degradation process of the cinder block. If it's painted cinder block, again, is it oil-based paint or is it latex paint? If it's latex paint and there's the mold growing on the paint on the cinder blocks, then that becomes a problem. And then we're probably looking at removing as much of the paint as possible, perhaps with a sand blasting or ice blasting type of professional remediation process to remove the latex paint and then treat those cinder blocks and then repaint with a microbial retardant type product. So, yeah, great question. Dealing with cinder blocks and concrete requires some expertise and is an important element of flood cleanup.
Some public health guidance says that flooded materials should be completely dried within 24 to 48 hours to prevent substantial fungal exposure. On your slide 9, you show that germination of fungal spores can occur in as little as 4 hours. Do you think that we have enough published evidence to consider changing the 24 to 48 hour to a lower time period? If yes, should we adjust this time frame by type of substrates as described in slide 10?
Okay, great question. No, I don't think we need to amend it at this time. The 4 hours has been shown from studies that have been done in actual flooded home environments where the question was, when mold colonies begin to appear and can be seen with the naked eye, how long has it taken to get to that point, visible mold growth? And the answer that came from those studies was that actually within 4 hours, there have been developed microcolonies that aren't yet visible to the eye, but very shortly will be. And between those 4 hours, when they can't be seen, to 24 hours is when they continue to grow. And so at the 24-hour mark, typically is when we can see the visible colonies. I guess the best advice is when there has been water damage, and I mentioned this several times in the presentation, drying is absolutely essential, getting the moisture out of the environment. There can be a delay. And again, someone is on vacation, they come home, and there's water in the home. It may have occurred the day before. we're talking about maximum and rapid removal of the water, the salvable materials, and the dry down as quickly as possible. So I think right now, based on the science involved, I think within 24 hours is fine. With the caveat, public health, people shouldn't delay, homeowners shouldn't delay in addressing water damage situations. This is very important too in rental housing, where portion of someone's basement is flooded, there's wet carpet and so forth. It's a Friday afternoon, the landlord says, I'll get to it on Monday. Well, that's the problem. No one should be waiting until Monday. The problem magnifies, amplifies. The microbial contamination will be extensive 72 hours later. So that's pretty much where we are in that regard. And I know local public health departments have a real concern for situations in tenant situations in housing. And what they can do is just advise landlords and tenants if there's any water damage at all, it should be attended to immediately to prevent a much larger hazardous situation in the future. We all do this in home environments too. We know there's a slight drip under the sink in the kitchen, and I'll get to it on the weekend. And the weekend never comes, and so weeks and months later, there's suddenly an odor in the kitchen. You open up under the sink, and you've got extensive mold growing on the wood cabinetry, on the back of the drywall, and now it's
Dr. Cole?
a much greater problem. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we're at the 2:30 mark, so we're going to have to conclude. Thank you, everyone, for joining EPA's Flood Cleanup webinar. Today's presentation will be available on EPA's Indoor Air Quality site soon. We will be sending a follow-up email with additional resources and links for those of you who attended and registered. Thank you so much again.